Welcome to Superhero Pow. I'm your host nerd, Tom Fremgen. As I've mentioned before, comic book fans love to group things into, well, groups. Mostly ages. Golden, silver, atomic, etc. And those often boil down to decades. And one of the best decades for comic books was the 1980s, when DC reinvented itself, and nearly the entire industry as well, with books like Batman the Dark Knight and The Watchmen. Yet one should not forget that Marvel was still the top-selling comic book company of the 1980s. And it wasn't just for nothing. David Michelin and Bob Layton were still killing it on Iron Man. Chris Claremont had his New Mutants and Excalibur, not to mention the non-Chris Claremont X title, X-Factor, or John Byrne's Alpha Flight and sensational She-Hulk, Frank Miller's Elektra, Bob Layton's Hercules, Sergio Aragonés's hilarious Gru the Wanderer, the amusing Peter Porker, the spectacular Spider-Ham, Jim Starlin's Dreadstar, Barry Windsor Smith's Machine Man, the surprising Power Pack, Steve Englehart and Marshall Rogers' Silver Surfer, Cloak and Dagger, Damage Control, Wolverine's solo books, and their great anthology series, Marvel Fanfare, and the Marvel graphic novels. Not to mention all their great licensed properties, like Rom Space Knight, The Micronauts, Star Wars, Transformers, G.I. Joe, and of course, Conan the Barbarian. All great stuff. But now let's look at the top 10 best stuff Marvel published in the 1980s. And by the best, I mean not just great sales, but stuff that's beloved and iconic as well. So let's start things off with number 10, The Death of Captain Marvel from 1982. As in Captain Mar-vel, Marvel's first Captain Marvel. While arguably not the first graphic novel, it was, at 64 pages, Marvel's first fully stated graphic novel, featuring the beautiful art and writing of Jim Starlin, with not the first, but one of the most impactful deaths not only in the Marvel Universe, but in all of comics as well. Starlin had already shown a talent for killing characters by offing Thanos, Warlock, Pip the Troll, and Gamora years earlier. But where they all died in a giant cosmos-saving battle, Captain Marvel merely died of cancer, much like Jim Starlin's own father did earlier. So in many ways, the story was more about death than it was Captain Marvel, as Starlin had the Kree-born warrior just slip away in a hospital bed. That's it. Very rarely does a superhero comic book deal with death as it really is. So the death of Captain Marvel as a superhero comic book stands as a moving achievement, despite the lack of superheroics. Number 9, the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. When it first came out in 1983, it was a comic book fan's dream. A detailed list of nearly every single Marvel character and more. No publisher had ever done something like this before. Of course, the advent of comic book shops helped. Based on his time helping Larry Hama put together dossiers for all the characters in the new G.I. Joe toy/comic book line, editor Mark Grunwald put together 480 pages of data and art of Marvel's proper universe. Then, as if that was just a dress rehearsal, he did it again in 1985 with the deluxe edition. This time he put together 1,028 pages, with more characters and much more room for art. Adding to the fun was the interlocking covers. Ed Hannigan did the first series, and the deluxe edition was done by John Byrne. For the first time, fans knew how tall and how heavy a superhero was. And more importantly, a way to tell who was stronger. Just how many tons could your favorite hero lift? Number 8, The Punisher. Let's face it, the 1980s was a time of bombastic, hard-boiled action. Just look at all the Arnold Schwarzenegger and Chuck Norris movies that were made then. So it's no wonder that The Punisher hit it bigger than anyone could have guessed, getting his first chance to fly solo in 1986 with a 5-issue miniseries by Stephen Grant and Mike Zeck. Mike Vosberg would draw the final issue. Soon after that, he was given a regular series written by the man who would make Frank Castle the legend he is today, Mike Baron. Under Mike's pen, The Punisher would become one of Marvel's top sellers, even spawning a sister series, The Punisher War Journal, written by Baron's editor, Carl Potts, although Baron would eventually write both series. The Punisher was a perfect hero for the 80s, a take-no-prisoners, do-or-die, go-big-or-go-home hero, with an impressive body count. Yet Baron managed to write him with enough wit, humanity, and ever-popular gritty self-doubt to prevent him from being just a one-note character. Joining Baron would be a long list of artists, including Klaus Janson, Wills Portacio, and Russ Heath. The Punisher was now a legitimate star at Marvel. Heck, not counting Howard the Duck, by the end of the decade, he was the only Marvel hero to get his own feature film, if it ever got fully released. Number 7. Squadron Supreme. They started out as a funny little joke, teaming up the Avengers with the Justice League, without DC's lawyers getting involved. But in 1985, Mark Gruenwald decided to break the superhero mold, a year before Alan Moore did it with The Watchmen, with his own 12-issue miniseries, where Squadron Supreme, Heroes from Another Earth, featuring Hyperion, Power Princess, Nighthawk, The Wizard, Dr. Spectrum, and others, overreach themselves and take over the world. The Utopia program. As one would guess, things get out of hand, and it's up to Nighthawk to defeat the Squadron and liberate the world. This is really the first time the heroes were cast as the villains, per se. Not being part of the standard Marvel universe, Gruenwald, along with artists Bob Hall and Paul C. Ryan, and one issue drawn by John Buscema, was able to shatter the status quo greater than any comic book had ever done before. Anyone who didn't overlook this series, because it didn't star the typical Marvel heroes, holds it in the highest regards, and deservedly so, because it's one of the best superheroes crossing the line stories ever, even though it isn't drenched in gritty realism, which would become the hallmark of all these types of stories in the years to follow. Number 6. Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars. The first big crossover event from 1984. Mind you, Marvel had Marvel Superheroes Contest of Champions 2 years earlier, but it didn't have the marketing or the crossover reach Secret Wars would have. Amusingly enough, it was born out of the concept that kids wouldn't buy a new line of Marvel superhero action figures without a comic book tie-in. So you need a comic book to help sell toys based on comic books. Okay? And according to Mattel Toys market research, it had to have the words Wars and Secret in it. Sure, why not? So Jim Shooter, the current editor-in-chief and general king of Marvel, wrote up the mother of all superhero crossovers. That is until DC outdid it the following year with Crisis on Infinite Earths. Artist Mike Zeck did most of the work, with Bob Layton filling in on 2 issues. While older and old-time readers didn't enjoy the ham-fisted storytelling, everyone else loved it, as nearly every popular Marvel superhero, and kinda every popular Marvel supervillain, was forced to duke it out in the ultimate good versus evil showdown for the omnipotent Beyonder. Shooter tried to keep things fresh with crazy story twists, but they usually just gummed up the works, as fans just wanted to see the fights. In the end, Spider-Man had a new costume, the Thing left the Fantastic Four, and Magneto started to become an anti-hero. But while Mattel didn't make much money, Marvel made a ton. So much so they quickly did Secret Wars 2, which was pretty much universally hated. Number 5. The Fantastic Four. The Fantastic Four has always been one of Marvel's better books, but clearly by 1981 it had gotten stale. Luckily for Marvel, the famous X-Men artist John Byrne was looking to write, and to get away from Chris Claremont. And it soon became apparent that if any book needed a kick in the pants, John Byrne was the guy to do it. For 60 issues, before DC lured him away to revamp Superman, John Byrne combined his 1980s modern sizzle with classic Fantastic Four storytelling, and Marvel's first family became a top seller again. Byrne refocused not only the relationship of the Fantastic Four with themselves, but their relationship with their classic foes too, like Doctor Doom and Galactus. He created the oh-so-Lee and Kirby villain Terminus, and pulled a Dark Phoenix with the Invisible Woman becoming Malice. But probably best remembered is the addition of She-Hulk, replacing the Thing thanks to the Secret Wars, taking a rather unremarkable character and making her a sensation in her own right. Did you get that? But he didn't forget the Thing, as Byrne wrote the Thing spin-off series for 2 years at the same time. So while John Byrne's Fantastic Four wasn't as iconic as Lee or Kirby's, it's still one of the best run the characters have had. Number 4, Spider-Man Last Hunt. Now on some level, Spider-Man had a lot of great things going on in the 1980s. Roger Stern brought us the Green Goblin replacement, Hobgoblin, and with fan Randy Schueller, Spider-Man's black costume, which David Michelini would turn into Venom. Jim Shooter got him married, while artist superstar Todd McFarlane would forever change the way Spider-Man could be drawn. But the real standout is the 6-part series Kraven's Last Hunt, published in Web of Spider-Man number 31 and 32, The Amazing Spider-Man number 293 and 294, and Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man in 131 and 132 in 1987. Written by J.M. DeMatteis and drawn by Mike Zeck. DeMatteis had the idea of a hero crawling out from his own grave for a while, but it wasn't until editor Jim Salicrup decided Spider-Man was the best home for the story, which DeMatteis then expertly crafted together using Kraven the Hunter as the man to kill Spider-Man. But Kraven does more than that. He replaces Spider-Man and takes down Vermin, a villain Spider-Man failed to take down himself. Kraven then believes this makes him better than Spider-Man, failing to understand that a man is more than just his accomplishments. The story rocked Spider-Man fans at the time and has become a tale for others to borrow heavily from, like Dan Slott's Superior Spider-Man run. Nearly every decade has a great Spider-Man tale, and this is the one from the 1980s. Number 3, The Mighty Thor. There was only one name when it came to the Mighty Thor in the 1980s, Walter Simonson. Simonson had drew some issues of Thor back in the 1970s, but in 1983 he came on to write and draw, and Marvel's mainstream hero became a superstar. From issue number 337 to 382, Walter Simonson wrote and drew, with fill-in work by Sal Buscema, Thor's most iconic run, next to the original Lee and Kirby, of course. Simonson just went hog wild with Thor, in storylines as well as with his highly stylized art, kicking things off with the Beta Ray Bill replacement story. Who ever heard of such a thing? And then creating the ultimate ball-buster curse, making second-run characters like Lady Sif, Balder the Brave, and Scourge the Executioner amazing and awesome, bringing in climactic showdowns with Hel and Surtur, growing a beard, gaining battle armor, being turned into a frog for crying out loud. Simonson's run had everything, including the mother of all battles in issue number 380. With Ragnarok in full swing, Thor faced off against his mythological arch-foe, Jormungand the World Serpent, destined to swallow the world itself. In a 24-page, all-splash-page smackdown, the likes of which comic book fans had never seen before. Walter Simonson had made Thor a must-buy book in the 1980s. Number 2, Daredevil. Easily one of the greatest creators of the 1980s is Frank Miller. While he started drawing Daredevil in 1979, he got his chance to write in 1981. And that's when things started to change for this run-of-the-mill Marvel superhero, who really hadn't stood out since, Wally Wood drew 7 issues back in the 1960s? But here, Miller would knock out 24 issues, changing the tone of Old Hornhead and redefining his origin with Stick and the Hand, which helped spawn the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles of all things. Then refined his villains with Bullseye and Ninjas, and of course redefined his love life with the introduction of Elektra. Then, after taking a break to do Ronin for DC, Miller would return to Daredevil in 1986 for another groundbreaking run, with the iconic Born Again story arc, writing 7 issues with artist David Mazzucchelli, in which Miller tore Daredevil's world apart, something no superhero had ever experienced before. and cemented Kingpin, a B-level Spider-Man villain, as Daredevil's greatest foe. Nearly every Daredevil story since has been based on Miller's iconic run. And lest we forget, when Miller left Daredevil for good, writer Ann Nocenti stepped in and created another fantastic female Daredevil character in the 1980s, Typhoid Mary. Number 1. The Uncanny X-Men, as if it could be anything else. In the 1970s, Len Wein and David Cockrum had given the failing X-Men comic book a new lease on life. Then Wein handed it off to Chris Claremont, and Cockrum handed it off to John Byrne, and the book became a bestseller. As it rolled into the 80s, the Uncanny X-Men grew even bigger and badder, with the introduction of the Hellfire Club, Mr. Sinister, the Brood, the Wolverine and Sabretooth rivalry, Rogue, Dazzler, Genosha, and lest we forget, the biggest stories of all time, Days of Future Past and the Dark Phoenix Saga. Even when Byrne left in 1981, the book easily maintained its #1 status with artists like John Romita Jr., Paul Smith, and Mark Silvestri. And even with the ever-growing insanity and wackiness of Chris Claremont's plots, with the likes of The Brood, The Mutant Massacre, and Inferno, it's his handling of the characters that brought the readers back month after month. While Stan Lee injected the Minority Mirror into the X-Men back in issue number 14, Chris Claremont is the writer who really capitalized on that angle, which has basically helped to keep the X-Men one of the greatest comic book franchises ever, regardless of the quality between the pages. And not to be forgotten, Louise Simonson's master villain creation from the 1980s in the pages of X-Factor, Apocalypse. And let's face it, with a few exceptions, the current X-Men comics do little but recycle all the concepts created in the 1980s. Well, there you go. And again, maybe not as industry-defining as DC's output was in the 1980s, but still some of the best work ever. The comic book industry has surely created great works since the 1980s, but if you ask me, they have yet to really match the greatness of that decade. Which in part is because publishers keep rehashing concepts and storylines created in the 1980s, barely giving the industry a chance to grow beyond it. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. And what did you think of our picks? Were we out of our minds, or did we nail it? I'm leaning towards nailing it. But be sure to let me know in the comments. And if you could be so kind to subscribe, I won't have to send Big Jim Shooter over to your house to slap some sense into you. I got his number here somewhere. No, that's a restraining order.